So, sympathise with my predicament today. My brief is to tackle the topic of understanding through the voice. However, I have to speak immediately after Simon Schaffer has given his paper. If you don't know directly, viscerally, in your bones, what understanding through the voice is after hearing Simon Schaffer's voice, then how can I hope to enlighten you? Perhaps I should give a whole paper on Simon Schaffer's voice. After all, I've been his close colleague for 30 years now, and I often think how odd it is, while the rest of the British population has to pay a broadcasting licence fee to listen to Simon's voice on In Our Time, e.g. yesterday morning, I'm actually paid my university teaching officer's salary to sit in committee meetings listening to him. Such is the luck of the draw. So my predicament easily leads to straightforward reflections. To what extent is understanding through the voice a result of enjoyment, pure pleasure, love of the voice? Or is it the other way around? Does our love of the voice arise in significant part from the understanding somehow born by the voice? What is the connection between understanding and that full-bodied basso profundo with earthy vegetal notes? I do want to observe that this response to the voice might be contrasted starkly and simply with our response to a scream, the scream of a baby in pain. Is the enjoyable voice necessarily a comforting voice, so that we might be tempted to view the voice as a background facilitator, allowing the accomplishing of other functions? Let's call this the lullaby function of the voice, when listening to the voice allows the attention to be drawn away from the task of resisting sleep, which then is able to gather its strength and wash over the fretful child. So is understanding through the voice carried on the background of this erotic relationship to the voice? Is the best way to open this question up is to take hypnosis as the model, in which the lullaby function and the trusting docility of the hearer combine to give great power to the voice? Or is it misleading to look to hypnotism with all the mysteries of speculative neurophysiological states that might entail? Shouldn't we rather turn to the power of singing, even though it too is an equal mystery? I will cut short this slide by taking heed from one of the greatest singers of recent times, Caruso. You know what you do when you shit? Singing, it's the same thing, only up. This little piece of wisdom tells us to go up, even though in reality it brings forcibly to our attention the other end of the body. If we took Caruso literally, to understand the voice, we might be driven to take a detour, converting the problem into understanding through the anus. I'm going to flee in the opposite direction. Go up and you arrive at the lungs and the larynx. Go a little bit further up and you arrive at the brain. That is where I would effectively start. We won't stay too long in the brain. My aim is to give a brief survey of the development of Freud's theories. But before I do so, I want to make some preliminary remarks about our overall general theme, the location of knowledge. The spatial turn in the history of science, which started over 20 years ago, encouraged us to look to the spatial location and architectural preconditions for the production of scientific knowledge. It was closely combined with the turn to practice. Some historians, for instance Ophir and Chapin, took up the concept of heterotopia that Foucault played with for a few months in 1967, the designation of a special space to be contrasted with utopia for special functions. There are heterotopias of crisis, for rite de passage, for honeymoons, for holidays, for carnival. Then there are heterotopias of deviation, rest homes and psychiatric hospitals, and of course prisons, and one should perhaps add retirement homes. Heterotopias can bring into one space incompatible functions of other spaces. Foucault's examples are the stage of a theatre, a cinema, a garden. Heterotopias are also transformed temporality, abolishing the past and the future, or opening up onto a vision of eternity in which past, present and future are flattened and universalized, as in libraries and museums. There are also special conditions of entry and exit, compulsory for some prisons or highly screened for others, monasteries and laboratories. Ophir and Chapin speculated that modern scientific institutions emerge as special heterotopic sites, beginning in the early modern period and culminating with the crystallization of observatories, laboratories and museums as the characteristic institutions of 19th century sciences. The heterotopic characteristic they highlight is the doubling up of function. At one and the same time, a mechanism of social exclusion and a means of epistemically constituting conditions of visibility. One space enclosed within the site is always a segment of an encompassing social space with which it is contiguous, from which its agents come and to which they return. The other space is the one in which the objects of a science appear. It is the space in which such entities as laws, cells, genes, particles, atmospheric pressure, and mental illness are made manifest and represented. These remain extremely fruitful reflections on the location of knowledge. Given our brief in this conference to, quote, look at how understanding focuses on a particular location and is formulated through that location, I suggest understanding through the voice, thank you, Simon, has had a privileged location in modern culture, one which maps easily onto the heterotopic spaces of modern science I've just described, the psychoanalytic consulting room. The heterotopia of psychoanalytic space is easily stated. It is a severely segregated space bounded by simple and rigid rules of entry and exit. One enters at 8:40 a.m., one exits at 9:30 a.m. One enters and lies down on the couch. One leaves by rising from the couch and with the most cursory of nods or goodbyes, leaves into ordinary life. In that 50-minute hour, time is extremely elastic, traversing all of time or the most instantaneous of moments. Throughout, the specification of the scene taking place is continually shifting. What is for certain is that it is doubled, if not tripled, and more. The scene is always the analyst and the patient, but it is also the child and its mother, the boy and his brother, the girl and her teacher, the spouse and the child, not to mention Oedipus and Tiresias, Jason and Medea, Pete and Dud, Bonnie and Clyde. The psychoanalytic space is both a site of a rite de passage, as one passes from ignorance to knowledge, innocence to experience, as pride takes its tumble onto the unforgiving floor, as long suppressed rage erupts and ends in tears, and it's also the space of all deviations, of perversion given its full reign. Foucault observes how Freud managed to concentrate in the psychoanalytic space with its impassible and unreadable analyst at its centre all the structures and strategies of asylum life as they had been developed in the prior 100 years. Freud did this not by abolishing them as such, but through concentrating them in a symbolic scene that produced the same effects without the same apparatus of architecture, of labouring practices, of daily routines, of isolation, judgment and forgiveness. As Foucault noted at the end of The History of Madness, here's a long quote, which I'm not going to read out for want of time, what Foucault does in this backhanded encomium is help us to see how Freud's construction of the psychoanalytic space drew upon a wide range of heterotopic practices, principally developed in the 19th century, but bound them together with an absolute minimum of props. Also a minimum direction, a minimum of guidelines and rules of thumb, while retaining their efficacy and scope. The psychoanalytic space can equally host a chain gang, a sitcom, child access litigation, or a funeral, not to forget a nursery. So what follows from Freud's encomium, from Foucault's encomium, is that Freud's innovation was a technical one. And the end result of the technical innovation was to concentrate all the functions of the asylum cum disciplinary machine into the person of the analyst. And the means of the technical innovation was simply to eliminate everything from the space that was not speech. This is a world without things. There are no things in psychoanalysis. Only the voice remains. No movement, no actions, no change in disposition of the visual field or of the body. Since we here encounter one of the principal genealogies for understanding through the voice in the modern era, it's worthwhile tracing the steps by which Freud constructed this voice machine. The canonical date for the beginning of modern brain science is 1861, when Paul Broca proposed that a specific site on the left hemisphere of the brain is the source of the capacity to speak. A patient who had suffered a stroke could still understand speech, but was deprived of all capacity to speak, except for the ability to say one word, tan. He died soon after his consultation with the doctor, and Broca's inspection of his brain led him to propose that the area he identified as damaged was the site in which the motor functions of speech were located. A research program was born, matching ever more refined descriptions of speech pathologies with the insults, as neurologists call them, to the brain, as ascertained by post-mortem dissection. Broca's first patient has become a truly mythical figure, the source of all modern brain science, his brain recently subjected to fMRI scans. The results of these scans, this is a paper from Brain in 2007, was to prove that Broca's area is not Broca's area, and the patient was not suffering from a lesion to Broca's area, but something far more extensive. And the authors of this paper actually go so far as to say if he had suffered a lesion to Broca's area, then none of the symptoms would have been produced and we wouldn't have had any brain science. But this is just a technical paper in Brain. There are no historians at work here. Freud's first book was a contribution to this literature, Zur Auffassung der Aphasien of 1891. It was a conceptual come clinical critique of the whole program, advocating a functionalist view of the brain overall rather than a structuralist account of specific modular functions. To undercut the excessively localizationist claims of the leaders of the research program, Freud insisted on a number of factors. The diffused associationist field, which needed to be taken into account in place of highly localized centers, not least because patients recovered from their loss of speech and thus other parts of the brain could perform their functions. In other words, the locations in the brain that performed these functions were not fixed, but were movable. Conversely, Freud picked out clinical accounts of minor functional loss, which it turned out on autopsy corresponded to massive brain injuries covering extensive tracts of the supposed centers of motor and acoustic function. Now, the enthusiastic research program impelled these doctors into developing more and more refined accounts of speech function, including hearing, speaking, writing, reading, and their relations to other symbolic activities. The idea of the program was to be able to impose a diagram of speech function on top of an atlas of the brain. So this is Freud's version of the Wernicke model. The attempts to do so became increasingly speculative and implausible. So the internal dynamic of the program was to have these two different aspects fall apart, like a delicately balanced house of cards, leaving well-delineated individual cards. On the one hand, speech functions, on the other, brain anatomy. So the progress from Wernicke to Freud can be seen in the following diagrams from Freud's book. This is what he calls the psychological schema of the word presentation, or the word object complex. So using the analysis of speech functions, and we see how speech functions have kind of replaced the brain atlas approach, Freud wrenched the basic division of aphasias from the nervous system-oriented sensory and motor aphasias to his preferred division. And this is his long quote. What I want to emphasize in this long quote, which I hope you can read faster than I would be able to read it out, is firstly his introduction a different, a non-sensory motor division between the aphasias. There's a first order aphasia, verbal aphasia, and a second order asymbolic. And Freud has seized the word asymbolic to refer to the relationship between word and object. And then, because that leaves the other meaning of a prior meaning of asymbolia vacant, he coins a new term. And I really can't work out if he had Huxley and Tyndall in mind. He certainly knew their work. In fact, he cites J.S. Mill on the same page as he has this diagram. So he's plugged into British psychology and philosophy. But he uses the word agnostic and agnosia. And this term has actually survived. So The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, famous piece by Oliver Sacks, that's a case, according to Sacks, of visual agnosia. And he footnotes Freud for that. Now, the psychology of speech is now preeminent in Freud's classification. In particular, his fastidiousness about calling the relationship between object and object presentation a symbolic one obliged to introduce the term agnosia. For the language-centered Freud, the term asymbolia referred to speech. And the loss of words for Freud was the loss of symbols tout court. Now, these dashing forays into the conceptualization of the aphasias were cashed out throughout Freud's later psychoanalytic writings in the following form. Freud always reserved a distinct and very important subsystem of the mind to the verbal residues, Wortreste. In his mythico-neurological tract of 1895, Project for a Scientific Psychology, speech associations are the means by which non-perceptual experiences can become conscious, i.e. the means by which we can become conscious of thought. They do this, Freud says, because speech associations formed a closed and exclusive system in parallel with the system of memory images. A part of the energy passing through the system, our brain scientists would call discharging through synapses, also energizes the speech neurons, sound images, motor images, and thus a report of motor discharge is received elsewhere in the system, allowing thought to become conscious. Speech has another fundamental function. The starting point of speech is the cry of pain, the baby's scream, on which is built its primary communicative function, the demand for food, for comfort, for care. Communication is speech's first function. Its second is representation, which arises in the following manner. The scream is associated with the object that caused pain. Quote, the information of one's own scream serves to characterize the object. Thus, this association is a means of making memories that arouse unpleasure conscious and objects of attention. The first class of conscious memories has been created. Not much is now needed in order to invent speech. It's entirely characteristic of Freud's mordant view of human nature that the first class of conscious memories are painful ones. It's also characteristic that from the beginning, speech serves two separate functions. Firstly, communication. Secondly, a means of being aware of and representing danger to oneself. The first represented object in consciousness is an object of frustration which causes pain. All this is in 1895, before Freud invents psychoanalysis. But this particular core of Freud's theoretical structure remains exactly the same throughout the development of psychoanalysis. So from 1911, we have this passage about that consciousness does not, thinking does not acquire further qualities perceptible to consciousness until it becomes bound to verbal residues. Or in 1923, when introducing the concept of the superego, he says, it is as impossible for the superego as for the ego to disclaim its origin from things heard, for it is a part of the ego and remains accessible to consciousness by way of these word presentations. So it seems almost plausible to say that the birth of psychoanalysis is to be found in Freud's identification with Broca's area in the brain. He renames this. He calls it the acoustic field. In the ego and the id, he even treats it as a whimsical familiar. The ego wears a cap of hearing, on one side only, as we learn from brain anatomy, it might be said to wear it awry. So that's a kind of picture of Freud. He is the cap of hearing. That is the psychoanalyst, occupying the function of consciousness and of the superego. Freud's attachment to the idea that speech has a very special function in the development of consciousness, that the entire dialectic between the conscious and the unconscious necessarily passes via speech, both developmentally and topographically, is persistent. The question naturally arises, was the distinctive heterotopia of the voice established in the psychoanalytic consulting room a result of this combination of brain research, in which the centrality of speech was never questioned, with the clinical resources and practices derived from Charcot, Breuer and others, which Freud cobbled together to make a living treating the nervous diseases? And my answer is a qualified yes. Takes two striking features of the heterotopia of the voice that is psychoanalysis. Firstly, speech is bluntly contrasted and opposed to action. The speech of psychoanalysis is deprived of all performativity. There are no consequences for anything said in the session. It is simply and notoriously just hot air. No contracts, no promises uttered, no threats issued, no murderous or erotic desires voiced have any standing as contract, promises, threats, or seductions. Psychoanalysis developed into a reality-free space. Here's a classic New York cartoon that demonstrates this. For those that right at the back, that's Eleanor. She's a fact checker. There are two anomalous features here that are intertwined cleverly. Before we even get to the anomalies, it's pretty obvious that this is a sadistic joke, as seen from the analyst's point of view. Just this once, the patient is not going to get away with all those tall stories and demeaning little lies, because there's a fact checker on hand. That's obvious. But then there are two shocking anomalies. There's a third party in the room, which is about as orthodox as having a sex therapist with you on your honeymoon. Second, there's the shocking and anomalous assumption that psychoanalysis might be about ascertaining the facts as they are normally understood. In analysis, what is omnipresent is speech, not facts. And within the psychoanalytic heterotopia, speech and facts are mutually exclusive in the way that chalk and cheese or oil and water are. To illustrate this point, to persuade you that speech, which is, of course, now to be understood both as the metaphysics of presence and as fantasy, to persuade you that speech, not facts, is what psychoanalysis is committed to, I'm now turning to a vignette from a paper by Joyce McDougall, a remarkable analyst from New Zealand who died in 2011, having started a training in London in 1952, moved to Paris in the 50s, where she remained the rest of her life. I also think this paper was, is the analysis that this is a paper of was conducted in French. There are internal reasons that give one. So there's a translation interest here as well. So the paper is entitled The Anonymous Spectator, a Clinical Study of Sexual Perversion from 1974. And it opens with the patient's speech. I hope you can read this. Life, it's a game and I know all the rules. Whether I win or lose, I don't give a damn. Let's say I find life amusing. Listening to this patient, I was struck by his dry, serious tone of voice, his stiff carriage, and the expression on his face, tight with anxiety, etc. There you have the passage. The patient, for whatever reason, decided to play the game of psychoanalysis alongside all his other games, playing at working, playing at finishing a book he had no intention of completing, playing at sexual relationships. In particular, his strict conditions concerning whipping his girlfriend's buttocks in order to secure satisfaction. He told his analyst that he'd considered the question of telling her about his sexual obsessions and concluded, well, if she wants to hear all this, she'll certainly be disappointed. I shall show and I shall also hide just whatever I please. McDougall's opening pages concentrate on the unfolding of her understanding of his sexual games, with the way in which his whipping of the girls morphed into his revealing how he would whip himself while looking in the mirror, eagerly searching for signs of the marks on his own body. These gains were designed to erase the difference, the complementarity of the sexes, and culminated in Professor K's reflection. It's finally clear to me that I disguise myself as a woman in order to become a man, as though I don't possess my own penis, or as though I need to get hold of a very special one. What's wrong with me? Am I homosexual? This question was not of great interest to McDougall, since it wasn't really of interest to Kay. Instead, she followed the theme of concealment to the following climax. More important, have I got this? No, I don't have this passage here. Okay, more important was the need to camouflage the identity of the participants in his play. The dramatic exchange between the woman and the girl before the gaze of the unknown looker indicated already an interesting transposition of the Oedipal constellation. So she's mentioned Oedipus, and of course, naturally, the next thing to say is, perhaps this is the moment to focus attention on Kay's parents, or at least on the manner in which he presented them. He let drop so little concerning his family that I had the impression he was a child without a past. For 2 years, I was not sure whether his father was dead or alive, or whether he had any brothers or sisters. I refrained from asking questions in the beginning and constructed, erroneously, from the information so sparingly offered, that he was the only child of a lonely mother. Now, this is the moment I want to highlight. For 2 years of 5 days a week analysis, this analyst listened to her male patient, not knowing if his father was alive or dead, and also not knowing whether he had any siblings. You would have thought that the most important fact to an Oedipalizing psychoanalyst is knowing the basic configuration of the family of her patient. But McDougall, being a classical analyst, i.e. someone who knows how to sustain the heterotopic conditions of the conversation, refrained from such questions. It's the configuration of the basic facts of his family, in other words, his family romance, as it emerges in his own words, that has her attention. No father, no brothers. Instead, the mirroring transferential relationship of his inner world. Quote, Kay's real world was in fact the imaginary one of childhood which he shared with his mother, and from which the other was excluded. Kay had wiped out the meaning of his father's role in the family constellation. So, in keeping with her strict adherence to the voice of the patient, the disavowed brothers emerged from the patient's speech in a rather dramatic fashion. Now, this is a very long quote, which is spread over 2 slides. I haven't got time to read it all out. But what we have here is, he leads up to saying, let's see, I know I must have been 6 when it happened. I remember that when my grandfather died, my little brother was just learning to walk. Then he pauses, and then he talks about something else connected, his hatred for his mother. And then the analyst says, when my grandfather died, my little brother was just learning to walk. Patient says, what do you mean? You tell me your mother adored you, she then explores. And then she says, by the way, this is the first time you ever mentioned the existence of a little brother. And he says, oh, I guess I never mentioned it. I'm the oldest of 4. So she was pretty unfaithful to you one way and another. Now, I want to highlight the fortuitous two sentences. This is when McDougall just repeats what he says. She doesn't change the pronouns, she just functions as echo. When my grandfather died, my little brother was just learning to walk. As if this was a block of speech with no meaning whatsoever. She just kind of transposed it and spoke it. And he says, what do you mean? He couldn't understand that his analyst was talking about his brother. That's because in his world, he doesn't have a brother. Doesn't have 1 brother, doesn't have 2 brothers, doesn't have 3 brothers. In his world, he doesn't have a brother. So this is the heart of what you would call the psychoanalytic relationship that has developed. This echo echo haunting Narcissus. That's what McDougall does. Now, where is the understanding through the voice? The Roman-faced commentary here by the analyst is surely a set of theoretical reflections prompted by the analytic process, stimulated by her patient. But it's not clear what process, what form of understanding the patient acquired. And I want to highlight, again, this passage that she says, when my grandfather died, my little brother was just learning to walk. And he says, what do you mean? I find it an astounding kind of index of complete lack of understanding, complete incomprehension of what you might call the other side of his life, the real side of his life, the side of his life that he no doubt is perfectly competent filling out forms for the state in which he has mother, father, etc., etc. But he can't hear it when his analyst says it. Now, there are clues to what kind of understanding the patient might have acquired. Let's look at this passage. Oops, I've forgotten to put it out. So at one point in the analysis, the patient says, I don't like to admit it to you, but for some time I've been working better, writing freely, even getting pleasure out of it. That may seem childishly simple, but I've never in my life felt like that. For me to be able to complete any project, I had to render it valueless, treat it like a game of no consequence. That I might want to create something, that it might have importance, makes my head reel. This recent triumph, it concerned a literary success, I owe to you, and this irritates me. I don't wish to be beholden to you for anything. Also, my success frightens me. I'm sick with anxiety, and I hold this against you. That's, both an index of a kind of shift in the relationship of the patient to himself and to his analyst, but also is entirely in keeping with what you expect. He hates the analyst because she's had an effect on him. I mean, put it at its most crude. And the hate, or the anxiety, that's the dominating thing. We're not in the world of understanding. We're really in the domain of the affects. That's what psychoanalysis is about. Hate, love, shame, rage, but not understanding. So this doesn't look like an understanding to me. It looks more like becoming aware of changes that he cannot understand and is not entirely happy with. So that's entirely typical of psychoanalysis from the patient's side of the conversation. But there is a deep blindness here among commentators on classical, i.e. Freudian, analysis. Many people say the aim is the analysis is insight. This may be true, but in Freud's work, the word Ansicht is never predicated of the patient. The analyst may have Ansicht, insight, but never the patient. Now, why is this obviously, to my way of things, the way to describe things? It's because the last thing analysis is a form of intellectual appreciation or discovery. What the patient does is not understand, but inhabit and undergo. What the patient does, he inhabits the emotional space which he himself creates. I'm sick with anxiety and I hold this against you. And he never stops doing this, nor do any of us for that matter. In Freud's hydraulic or electrical circuit metaphors for the analytic process, there's no room for understanding. Instead, there's shift of energies, the emergence of new emotional constellations, or a shift in consciousness. But becoming aware of something is not the same as understanding. Freud's model here is perceptual, not cognitive. Becoming aware is like seeing, not reflecting. Speech allows one to make connections, maybe even new connections, the model of the verbal residues, but this is not understanding. It's a process of change, principally of emotional configuration. Not the sort of thing one can understand, rather the sort of thing one enacts. Now, the preoccupation with psychoanalysis as a heterotopia of the voice has been a persistent one for a century now, not only Ricoeur and Habermas, but also most prodigiously Lacan and Derrida. The first wave of Lacanian theorizing is a metaphysics of full speech, as he proclaimed it, with its twin formulae: the unconscious is structured like a language, and the unconscious is the discourse of the other. In his virtuoso fable of the analytic encounter as a game of bridge, the patient sits opposite the analyst, playing against his twinned objects, the mother and the other. The analyst plays dummy, of course, le mort in French. As dummy, his freedom of movement is extremely restricted. The cards on the table may be his, but they're played by his partner. And in a shift of the metaphor, Lacan portrays the analyst as the voice of the unconscious, the patient's unconscious, which as dummy, as death, the analyst strictly fails to understand. Hence the moment in McDougall's analytic conversation, which is psychoanalysis at its purest, when she says, "When my grandfather died, my little brother was just learning to walk." She had no idea what the significance of the sentence was, but she knew that this absolutely essential psychoanalytic intervention was to repeat this incomprehensible phrase, which the patient had laid on the table as her hand. So, in the Freudian account of the heterotopic psychoanalytic process, the patient certainly doesn't understand anything. The analyst doesn't expect the patient to understand. She expects him to change. In the Lacanian account, it's the analyst who is beached on the island of non-comprehension, sleepwalking through the signifiers, rearranging and reaffirming them as he or she goes. So there's little understanding going on here. Now, why is this? Perhaps another of my favourite New Yorker psychoanalytic cartoons can help. On the left, Lassie gets up. On the right, Lassie on the couch. The hilarity of this cartoon stems from a combined doubt and a mistaken interpretation of a word. First, there is the universal doubt that psychoanalysis is good for anything. Believing that it can help you is to live in cloud cuckoo land. Second, there is a joke at the expense of the temporal process. Everyone knows that psychoanalysis takes a very long time. So if you need help now, this second, the last person to turn to is a psychoanalyst. Thirdly, and most importantly, it's not Lassie who needs help, but the drowning man. If Lassie lies on the couch free associating, I suppose we will have to call it free barking, this might help her with her doggy relationship problems, but it won't help someone else, the drowning man. It is as if Lassie heard him cry out, "Lassie, get help," and responded, "Yes, help. That's a good idea. I could use some of that." So these two jokes. So we have a curious state of affairs. The voice as medium of the psychoanalytic process, which is precisely designed to be unreal in the sense of opposed to action and reality, instigates a process of experience which is for the patient neither memorable nor retrospectively remarkable. Excuse me. One comes away with no souvenirs or snapshots, nobody of knowledge fit for purpose or potentially examinable. For the analyst, on the other hand, there is the residue of psychoanalytic material ready to be theorized and communicated to other analysts, turning the voice of the other into writing. Yet the opposite interpretation seems equally apt. Freud's brain scientific and theoretico-psychological mappings of the speech apparatus as the verbal residues and their function shows us, as I hinted above, the point of identification in the brain for the supremely gifted verbal practitioner that he was. We can learn about the future analyst by studying the properties of the speech center in the brain. What do we learn? That speech makes possible new functions, both cognition and memory of thought. It distinguishes thought reality from perceptual reality. It codes into a closed and restricted system the flux of experience, so enabling mastery of the inner world. And that things heard form the core of both ego and superego, as if we each are founded upon an internal memorized or hardwired phonic text, a default hard disk of sound. It's easier to see how the psychoanalytic situation reenacts the disposition of the speech apparatus in the brain. The sole function of the analyst is to listen, to repeat when necessary, to reorder the signifiers, as Lacan would put it, and thus facilitate a more appropriate functioning of the whole system, i.e. the patient. Instead of the subject screaming at a hallucinated breast, the speech system allows communication with others about the subject's plight, and in addition a reordering of perception, so that The orders of thought and imagination arise alongside that of perceptual reality. The difficulty in terming this understanding arises from the fundamentally mechanistic or functionalist account that comes so naturally to Freud. For his progeny, psychoanalysis functioned as a heterotopic space, a machine for understanding through speech. It seems obvious that that is what it is. However, as I've indicated in this paper, it's not quite as simple as that. If only we might finally reflect, we could hear ourselves speak. Thank you.
So, John had the problem of following the Schaefferian voice. I faced the even greater difficulty of following John Forrester on psychoanalysis, a topic on which he is one of the world's leading authorities. In keeping with the interdisciplinary structure of the day, however, I speak as a literary critic, one for whom the voice has very different resonances, but also as someone with an interest in the history of psychology pre-Freud. In his compelling depiction of psychoanalysis as a heterotopia of the voice, John creates an almost Beckettian vision. All the cacophony of competing sites of social and scientific exchange is excluded as we narrow ever inward to be left with just a voice talking as if to itself in a room. His interpretation of the McDougall case study is convincing, and certainly to a psychoanalyst, agnostic, or even atheist myself. The understanding does appear all on the side of the analyst, and the fact that the patient and the analyst can have been in the same room 5 days a week for 2 years without her obtaining the most basic facts about family structures does appear to me almost mad. However, in his concluding paragraphs, John suggests that an opposite interpretation is equally apt. The structure of the paper is perhaps like the process of psychoanalysis itself, as we're offered, in conclusion, a reversal of our previous understandings. It's not quite clear to me, though, however, how far the interpretation he sketches out at the end is actually an opposite interpretation, and then what elements need to be reworked or recast within this reworking. So I'd welcome some further development of the argument here. Particularly, I'm not sure how far it affects the argument that speech in psychoanalysis loses all performativity. Certainly, I think this is not the case for the analyst, who, as you see in her account, reads denial or defiance into the speech. So these are performative elements of speech, I'd say, taking place within the exchange. Now, I started with a Beckettian image of the person talking as if to himself in the room. But of course, that is a huge as if. Following on from the idea of the importance of the voice in psychoanalysis, I would suggest that the unspoken dialogue between the analyst and patient is as important as the speech itself. That continuous, almost free flow of speech is nonetheless structured by the situation. This is not the possibly mad speech of someone alone in their room, but a paid-for, highly structured encounter. The speech of the patient is set in counterpoint and dialogue, I think, with the analyst, whose minimal interventions form, for the patient, part of a continuous but largely unspoken dialogue between the two. Now, I very much liked John's placing of Freud's work in the context of Broca's research on language localization, although I assume it remains true that Freud, whilst retaining the centrality of speech, nonetheless countered the arguments of specific localization. The tracing of Freud's early views on the origins of language was fascinating, which, as John comments, in keeping with Freud's mordant view of human nature, was located in pain, in the baby's cry. The argument that thinking was originally unconscious and that it did not acquire further qualities perceptible to consciousness until it became bound to verbal residues, places Freud directly in relation to another area of psychology of the time, that of child development, where there were intense debates at this period as to whether it was possible for a child to think before it entered the realm of verbal speech. Thus you find in Germany, France, England, and particularly the States, huge numbers of people devoted in what was called the child study movement to studying all the aspects of early development of speech. And also you've got literary autobiographies, figures trying to describe their first movements into consciousness and into speech. And they always tended to claim that they had an extensive capacity for thought prior to speech. However, I assume that this stance is very different to that of Lacan, if I'm remembering rightly. I should say, speaking in Cambridge here, I'm taken very much back to my time in the 1970s. I was a member of a critical theory reading group where we very dutifully read our way through Freud, Lacan, Althusser, etc. But for Lacan, I think, and John must correct me if I'm wrong, I would assume that he does think that thinking cannot exist before language. Freud's stance with regard to speech, as John notes, is not particularly special or distinctive at the period, but is crafted out of elements of 19th century brain science and psychology. Indeed, one can find all sorts of precursors of elements of Freudian theory in 19th century psychology and in more literary psychological speculations prior to the 1870s or 1890s. And one of my favourite examples is that of the writer Frances Power Cobb in an 1870 essay called Unconscious Cerebration, who seems to anticipate Freud's psychopathology of everyday life in her analysis of the relationship between internal or unconscious and external speech. Thus she offers an account of a man whose social existence is poisoned by his unconquerable propensity to say the wrong thing to the wrong person. Thus, if he have an acquaintance whose brother was hanged or drowned or, oddly, scraped to death with oyster shells, then, to a moral certainty, the subjects of capital punishment, the perils of the deep, and the proper season for eating oysters will be the topics selected by him for conversation during the awkward 10 minutes before dinner. Dreams were also the focus of much theorising and popular speculation. Thus, a popular article in the periodical Argosy of 1866 on dreaming suggests that out of the chaos of dreams, a man may now and then extract a curious self-knowledge. Examining a dream, he suggests, is like looking into the interior of a watch. You see the processes by which the results are obtained. A man thus becomes his own eavesdropper. He plays the spy upon himself. So, is psychoanalysis a formulation of the process whereby a man, through the outward flow of speech, becomes his own eavesdropper or spy upon himself? Now, with all these elements in play, I've often been speculating why it is that medics were not paying more attention to the testimony of their patients prior to Freud and this of the 1890s. Part of that reason, I think, lies in disciplinary antagonisms that were developing. Particularly, I find this in England in the 1870s, and I refer here to a bit of work I did on a big trial and dispute concerning spiritual pathology, where on the one hand you have the Anglo-Catholics trying to reintroduce confession into the Church of England, and then on the other you have the burgeoning science of psychiatry. And J.S. Bucknell, psychiatrist, addresses the British Medical Association, suggesting that, and it's called Confession, the Physician and the Priest, and he suggests that in order for the psychiatrist to avoid any taint of the confessional, the physician should eschew any patient testimony and instead endeavour to obtain the history of those diseases of the nervous system which most seem to justify confession from a relative rather than from the patient himself. So the very act of giving voice was deemed to exacerbate the sexual problem, but also to taint the physician himself. Now, John discusses Freud's creation of what he terms the voice machine. And this was, of course, the great period of voice machines, of technologies of the voice, the invention, of course, of the telephone or the phonograph. And it's the first period from which we actually have an archive of the voice. So it's possible to hear Lord Kelvin or to hear Tennyson reciting verses across the centuries. The great debate at that time was also whether speech was the Rubicon between man and animals and whether this could now be tested. So you have lots of experiments on whether monkeys can speak. Most wonderfully, I think, Richard Garner, who in a wonderful inversion takes himself off to Africa and sits in a metal cage with his phonograph trying to get recordings of the speeches of monkeys or gorillas. So it was a period then of a great flurry of inventions surrounding the voice, including what was dubbed the whispering machine, which I will suggest is a Victorian equivalent of the Walkman. So what this machine is, it was based on the idea of the phonograph, and it was proposed that a man would wear a hat, and in the hat would be the wax cylinders. I'm drawing from an article here called Whispering Machines. So they placed this hat with the sounds conveyed to the ears by wires, which would enable all books to be both recorded and listened to orally. And the author gets very carried away with the notion of what could be possible with this. So he suggests that with this machine, it would accompany men to the office, to the factory, to the bench, to the field, to the ditch, down into the mines, whispering into their ears greater thoughts and imaginations, strengthening, ennobling, and refining the mind. It's a wonderful comparator, I think, for the ways in which we're actually using the Walkman or the iPod. The writer suggests that, in fact, it would solve all the problems of world sort of disharmony and lack of cultural understanding, because, of course, you'd now be able to learn all the world languages by simply sort of walking to work with your machine on your head. So this notion, then, that this constant whispering would transform the very basis of what it was to be human. Now, to conclude, John, I'm not sure whether you included in your final version, but in the written version I was given, you did ask whether poetry is a form of understanding, but you decided not to go there, literally. As a literary critic, I feel duty-bound, however, to rise to the challenge and suggest that there are strong parallels between the functioning of the voice in verse and in the unconscious. In rhyming verse, for example, the forward trajectory of meaning is always being pulled back by the lingering associations of sound. And so just to take an example, a verse from the opening of In Memoriam, a poem, of course, addressed to that great analyst in the sky who might or might not be listening. Thou wilt not leave us in the dust, thou madest man, he knows not why. He thinks he was not made to die, and thou hast made him, thou art just. What we've got here is the plaintive rhyme of die feeding back to why. Why, oh why do we die? But then the final assertion, thou art just. But of course it feeds directly back to the opening of the verse, dust, which then is a precursor for later on in the poem, the idea of time being a maniac scattering dust. So the associative meanings which lie outside of sense and sequence and the omnipresence of the past in the way in which verse functions strongly parallels, I would suggest, the workings of the unconscious, which, as Freud showed in his work on puns, work with the spoken qualities of language. So I suggest we could perhaps improve upon Lacan's dictum that the unconscious is structured like a language, and suggest rather that the unconscious is structured like a poem.